This portrait was taken in the autumn of 1856 inside a refined parlor in Charleston. At first glance, it appears calm and composed, a wealthy household gathered for a formal photograph. The father stands firm, the mother's hands folded, their eldest daughter resting one hand on an ornate chair. And at the far right, positioned as if to blend into the wallpaper, stands a young enslaved boy named Elias. His bare feet rest on patterned carpet. His clothing is simple, pressed, and intentionally plain. His chin remains slightly lowered, not out of shyness but out of learned caution. This was the rule: be present but invisible. Silent, still, obedient. For more than a century this image drew no questions. Archivists labeled it plainly, Family Portrait 1856. It was filed away, stored, and forgotten. The family's names were recorded in historical directories. Elias was simply noted as servant boy. Hundreds of portraits like this exist. Faces preserved, stories erased. Then, in 2023, historian Dr. Clara Hawthorne began digitizing early American daguerreotypes. When she scanned this portrait at high resolution, she paused. Something about Elias's hand seemed unusual. His fingers were curled inward, not relaxed at his side. Clara zoomed closer. Between the boy's palm and thumb lay a small metal object. Not an ornament, not a toy. A key. It was partially concealed, angled toward his body as if meant to be hidden. A key that did not belong to a child. A key that could open something locked. A key that should never have been in his possession. This was not an accident. It was a message, a risk, and a story waiting to be uncovered. Before we continue, please subscribe and comment to support the channel. Grave of the Shadows. Dr. Clara Hawthorne had spent most of her career in quiet rooms, archives, university basements, museum storage vaults. She didn't chase headlines. She chased silence, dust, and the overlooked fragments of history hidden in boxes no one had opened in decades. In late November of 2023, she was working through a series of family daguerreotypes donated by descendants of the Marston family, a once prominent household in South Carolina. Her task was straightforward: scan, label, catalog, store. Hundreds of images. Hundreds of frozen faces. Most blended together: stern fathers, delicate daughters, staged civility. The Marston portrait nearly joined them. But Clara had always trusted her instincts. And something about the way the child stood at the edge of the composition unsettled her. His stillness seemed different, not posed but controlled, as though he understood too much for his age. She adjusted the lighting. She magnified the boy's hand. When she saw the small, curved fragment of metal between his fingers, she didn't gasp. She stopped breathing entirely. Clara set aside her routine. She began researching the Marston household, their business dealings, their enslaved servants, and the city records from that year. What she uncovered in the days that followed was not just a story. It was a hidden act of defiance. And Elias, the quiet child in the corner, was its center. Charleston in 1856 was a city of polished elegance built upon unspoken brutality. Carriages rolled along cobblestone streets, church bells marked each passing hour, and the scent of jasmine gardens drifted from behind wrought iron gates. Visitors praised the refined manners, the refined architecture, the refined society. But refinement came at a cost paid in human lives. The Marston household was one of the older estates in the city. White walls washed bright in the sun, shaded patios draped in creeping ivy, and a wide veranda where guests would sip tea while discussing trade, politics, or the rumored price of cotton that season. The Marstons traded in rice and indigo, their wealth woven from the labor of men, women, and children forced into servitude. Inside the house, every surface gleamed. Polished mahogany. Heavy damask curtains. Silver-framed mirrors catching slivers of daylight. The portrait was staged in the parlor, a room meant to display taste, order, and status. Every detail, down to posture and gaze, was deliberate. The Marston family stood at the center of the frame. Edwin Marston, the patriarch, carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed his authority unquestionable. His wife, Margaret, wore composure like jewelry. Their daughter, Catherine, dressed in lace, embodied the gentle expectations of girlhood in such a household. And then at the far right stood Elias, a child of 7. Bare feet on patterned carpet. Shirt clean but coarse. Eyes lowered, not in humility but in survival. He belonged to no family name recorded in city registries. His mother, Lydia, worked in the kitchen preparing meals she could never eat in full. His father, Jonas, had once labored in the rice fields outside the city, but Elias had no memory of him. Jonas's name existed only in whispers among the enslaved, not in documents. Not in ledgers. Not in the world that counted. In the Marston home, enslaved individuals moved like shadows. Early in the morning, late in the evening, always present but never seen. They learned the rhythm of steps on the staircase, the tone behind a summons, the difference between silence for safety and silence for grief. Elias learned quickly. He learned how to stand still, how to quiet his breath, how to disappear. Which is why, when he chose to appear, when he chose to hold something he was never meant to hold, that choice meant everything. Clara adjusted the scanner's magnification settings, narrowing the field to focus solely on Elias's hands. The boy's fingers were small, delicate, almost bird-like. Yet there was intention in the way they curled inward, as though they protected something. Most children posed in photographs of that era with open hands or stiff arms. That was the instruction photographers gave: hold still, remain loose, do not clench. But Elias's right hand was not loose. It was tight, purposeful, guarded. Clara leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching the monitor. At first, she thought it might have been a wrinkle in the photographic plate or an imperfection in the polishing of the silver surface. But as she adjusted the contrast and lighting, the object sharpened into view. Metal. Smooth. Curved. Small enough to fit in the palm of a child, yet unmistakably crafted. Was a key. Not the ornamental kind used for jewelry boxes or desk drawers. This key had a narrow stem and a squared bow, formed for locks meant to restrain. Locks found on cellar doors, storage rooms, or shackles. It was a key Elias had no reason to possess. A key he could be punished for holding. A key that, if discovered during the photograph, would have halted the session instantly. The photograph itself would never have existed. So why hold it then? Why risk everything in that one moment when stillness was demanded, when silence was enforced, when eyes were watching? Clara's pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't an overlooked detail. It was a message preserved across time, a message hidden in plain sight. Elias had placed the key where the world would one day be forced to look. Clara did not speak about her discovery at first. She needed evidence, documents, context, something beyond instinct and intuition. A key alone could be dismissed as speculation. But a key held like a secret? That demanded explanation. She began with the Marston family archives, which were housed in the Charleston County Historical Registry. The clerk on duty, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, retrieved a series of ledgers bound in cracked leather. They were careful records: crop yields, household expenses, property valuations. Names listed alongside values. And there, on a yellowed page dated March 1856, was a line. Elias, age 7, household attendant. Not servant. Not worker. Property. The ledger listed items beneath him, not above. Tools. Livestock. Storage keys. Clara circled the entry gently with her fingertip. The handwriting was precise, Edwin Marston's own. She kept reading. Further entries named Lydia, assigned to kitchen labor, and Jonas, noted only once years earlier. No notation of illness. No burial record. Just a sharp stroke of a pen and a blank space where a life had ended. Clara turned pages slowly as if the paper itself might bruise. Next came a locked drawer of household correspondence, which the museum granted her special permission to review. Most letters were routine exchanges. Invitations to dinners, orders for imported fabrics, seasonal complaints about heat. But several letters from Margaret Marston's sister stood out. They described Lydia as difficult since the boy grows older, and mentioned the child's worrying curiosity. Another letter, dated only a month before the portrait, read, "The small one has taken to wandering. Margaret fears he listens where he should not. Edwin insists discipline must be maintained. Lydia pleads. I cannot say which wound cuts deeper, punishment itself or the fear of it." Clara paused. Her jaw tightened. She needed more than polite letters. She turned to the First Calvary Church ledger, where enslaved births and family ties had been recorded carefully, quiet acts of preservation disguised as attendance lists. There she found them together, Lydia and Elias, marked with a small charcoal star beside their names. The star appeared only beside those considered at risk of being sold or separated. And beneath their entry was a faint, nearly erased annotation. Jonas, skilled in ironwork, removed. Clara sat back. Ironwork. Keys. Locks. Hinges. The father Elias never remembered was a blacksmith. Suddenly, the metal in the child's hand was no longer just a key. It was inheritance. A craft passed down not through tools and apprenticeship, but through stories, memory, and the dangerous knowledge that metal could open what was meant to stay closed. But the question remained. What had Elias intended to unlock? And at what cost? Clara was no longer searching for a detail in a photograph. She was following the beginning of a resistance. Before the portrait, before the key, before the moment frozen in silver and light, Elias's world existed in the quiet corners of the Marston estate, places where sunlight rarely reached and voices softened to whispers. He was born in one of the back rooms that servants used for sleeping, a narrow space with floors worn smooth from countless feet. His mother, Lydia, held him close in those early years, humming songs remembered from a place she had not seen since she was a child herself. Lydia knew how to move through the household unseen. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, scrubbing pots, preparing meals she was never invited to taste at a table. Her voice was soft but steady. And when she spoke to Elias at night, her tone changed. It became warm. It became home. She told him stories not of Charleston but of a riverbank far away. A place where her own mother had braided her hair in the shade of a tamarind tree. A village where people spoke in rhythms and laughter carried through the morning air. She described the sound of drums, of wet earth after rain, of her father's calloused hands shaping wood into tools. Elias did not know that place. Yet he knew its memory through her voice. His father, Jonas, had been a blacksmith on a neighboring estate. Strong, quiet, thoughtful. He worked with fire and metal, shaping iron as though it were clay. The sound of hammer strikes had once echoed through Elias's earliest days, sharp, rhythmic, certain. Jonas had taught Lydia how to mend broken hinges and shape small nails. And once he had shown Elias something too. Not how to forge, not yet, but how to recognize a lock. How its weight told a story. How metal could bind, but also how metal could open. Jonas disappeared when Elias was 4. The official record said removed. The truth lived only in Lydia's silence. After his father vanished, Elias learned to watch more carefully. He listened when no one believed he was listening. He noticed keys, how many hung on the wall in the pantry, which ones the overseer kept on his belt, which ones fit which doors. But he also learned something deeper. Some locks were made for storage. Others were made for people. And Lydia feared the day one of those locks would be used against her son. In the months before the portrait, the atmosphere in the Marston household shifted. Elias noticed voices behind closed doors. Lydia's whispers became shorter. The overseer's gaze lingered longer. And sometimes, late at night, Lydia held him just a second too long, as though she was trying to memorize the shape of him. Elias understood fear before he understood its name. Yet he also understood resolve. So when his hand closed around the small iron key, it was not random. It was not childish curiosity. It was memory. It was lineage. It was the last thing his father had given him. The belief that a locked door was not a fate. It was a challenge. The key did not come from the parlor, nor from a cabinet, nor from a drawer. It came from a place no child was expected to go, the carriage house workshop, where unused tools hung from pegs and where once, a forge had burned hot beneath Jonas's hands. The workshop had been quiet since his disappearance. Dust settled on the iron tongs, the shaping block, the bellows. But a small wooden box remained in the corner behind crates of feed, wrapped in a leather strap. Jonas had kept personal items inside it, tiny fragments of a life that slavery tried to strip away. A carved bead, a smooth pebble, and a set of small keys of his own making, practice pieces meant to teach precision before forging large locks. Jonas never finished those lessons. But Elias remembered where he kept them. The key in the photograph was one of those. The smallest, the most ordinary looking, the easiest to overlook. But it was not meant for jewelry boxes or drawers. It was meant for restraining locks, the kind used on the narrow cellar door beneath the Marston house. And that cellar did not store vegetables. It stored people. Whenever the estate suspected that an enslaved worker might run, resist, or disobey, they were locked in the dark stone chamber until someone decided the lesson was learned. Sometimes it was hours. Sometimes days. Sometimes death. Lydia had been taken there once. Elias remembered the night she returned, her steps slow, her breath ragged, her voice a whisper that trembled but never broke. She held him though her arms were shaking. After that, something in Elias changed. Fear remained, but beneath it another force took root, resolve. What Clara discovered next came from church records, carefully coded to protect the enslaved who shared information quietly, subtly, dangerously. A string of notations marked meetings in the weeks leading up to the portrait. Small charcoal symbols beside names indicated a message passing among them. Someone was planning to escape. And then she found it, A final note marked with a star, nearly faded away. Lydia and 3 others to depart on the turn of the tide. Assistance waiting by the wharf. Key obtained. Clara inhaled sharply. Elias had not taken the key for himself. He had taken it for them. He planned to open the cellar door at night, free the 2 men who had been locked inside for planning escape, and meet Lydia behind the carriage path. Together, they would slip through the alleyways to the wharf where a fisherman, one of the few free black men allowed to move between Charleston and Wilmington, waited to carry them under darkness. It was not just escape. It was family. It was love refusing to die quietly. The night before the escape, Elias placed the key in his pocket, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He would not run alone. He would not leave his mother behind. He would not let Jonas's memory end in silence. But the morning of the portrait, unplanned, inconvenient, commanded with no room for refusal, interrupted everything. The key was already hidden in his hand. The photograph captured that exact moment. A boy standing in quiet rebellion, waiting for the night that might save them all. Clara stared at the daguerreotype on her monitor, realizing the image did not show a passive child. It showed a child preparing to change fate. The question now was not what Elias intended. It was what happened when the night came. The night chosen for escape was windless, heavy, and thick with summer heat. Cicadas buzzed in the garden. Lanterns in the main house burned low. The Marston family had retired hours earlier. It should have been safe. Elias waited behind the carriage house, the key cold in his fist. His breath came shallow and fast, though he tried to quiet it. Lydia met him there, her shawl drawn close, her hands trembling, not from fear but from urgency. 2 men waited in the darkness, their wrists still bruised from cellar chains. They whispered thanks to Elias, calling him brave, calling him son, calling him hope. The lock clicked open smoothly. Jonas's lesson, passed through memory, through love, through loss, had worked. The cellar door eased outward. The men climbed into the night air like drowning men breaking the surface of the sea. Lydia took Elias's hand. Together, they turned toward the narrow path leading to the wharf. And then, a voice. Sure. Familiar. The overseer. He had not slept. Not that night. Not since rumors began to stir among the enslaved. His suspicions were not brilliant. They were born of control and habit. And when he saw movement where there should have been stillness, he followed. The shout shattered the quiet. The men ran. Lydia pushed Elias forward. Run. Run now, run and don't look back, run with everything inside you. But children are not built to outrun grown men who have done nothing their entire lives but chase. The overseer seized Elias by the arm. Lydia screamed, a sound that tore through the humid night, a sound that could not be forgotten once heard. One of the men turned back, desperate to help her, but the other held him tight. If you turn back, she did this for nothing. The escape shattered. The key fell from Elias's hand, hitting the dusty ground with a sound smaller than a teardrop, yet louder than any bell. By morning everyone knew. The Marston family did not call for the men who escaped. They called for Elias. A child. 7 years old. He was not beaten in the yard. They wanted no marks to show their loss of control. Instead, Edwin Marston made a quiet decision, one that left no blood but carried far greater cruelty. He is to be sold. Lydia fell to her knees. Not to beg, she knew begging held no weight, but because her body could no longer hold the shape of standing. Her hands clawed at the ground. Her face twisted into grief too large for sound. They removed Elias before sunrise. No farewell. No final embrace. No time. Lydia's scream did not break the morning. It swallowed it. Clara read the bill of sale in silence, the paper trembling in her hands. The record listed Elias as property transferred to a trader bound for Georgia. No note of family. No mention of love. Just a number. A weight. A price. The portrait Clara had studied so carefully was taken hours before the attempt. A boy holding the key to his mother's freedom. A boy moments away from losing everything. The photograph had never been peaceful. It had always been a goodbye. The ledger stated only that Elias was transported south, along with 14 others, in a chain of wagons bound for the interior plantations of Georgia. For most children taken in such convoys, the trail ended there. Names vanished into heat and dust. But Clara refused to believe that a life so purposeful, so lived, could simply disappear. She followed records wagon by wagon, plantation by plantation, tracing shipments of enslaved workers through crumbling manifests and brittle freight ledgers. Some pages were missing. Others stained by rain, sweat, or something darker. Yet one entry dated spring of 1857, caught her attention. Boy Elias. Assigned to Millard Estate. Field labor unsuited. Transferred to house staff. House staff meant proximity, voices, language, learning, not isolation. Clara searched further. And slowly a new picture formed. The Millard Estate's older cook, Ruth, had taken Elias into her kitchen. Not to soften him to servitude, but to keep him alive. Ruth herself had been separated from 2 children years earlier. When she saw the boy's distant stare, the way his small hands curled inward when he slept, she recognized the shape of his sorrow. She taught him where to stand to avoid notice. How to move silently. When to listen and when to appear busy. How to guard the parts of himself the world wanted to break. Ruth could not return his mother to him. But she could give him time. And time became a key of its own. As the years passed, Elias grew. His hands grew steadier. His thoughts grew sharper. He learned to read not from books, there were none, but from watching lips, memorizing sermons, tracing letters drawn in spilled flour on the kitchen table before Ruth swept it away. Then came 1864. Union soldiers pushed through Georgia in a storm of blue coats and burning fields. Plantations crumbled. Chains loosened. Doors opened. And word traveled faster than musket fire. Freedom was coming. When soldiers reached the Millard Estate, they found Ruth standing in the doorway of her kitchen, Elias beside her, not as property, not as shadow, but as someone waiting to step forward. The officer who interviewed the freed workers wrote a brief line in his journal. The boy looked tired but unbroken. Clara closed her eyes when she read that. Unbroken. The photograph had shown a child moments before his world was torn apart. And yet the story did not end there, not in chains, not in silence, not in erasure. Elias did not remain the boy in the corner of the portrait. He survived. The world that tried to contain him failed. Elias did not disappear into the chaos that followed the war. With the guidance of Ruth and other freed elders in the community, he found work in a newly formed freedmen's school in Savannah. At first he swept floors, arranged benches and carried firewood. But soon he began to sit near the doorway while lessons were taught, tracing letters in the air with his finger, memorizing every sound. By 1868 he could read. By 1872 he was teaching others. He taught children first, children who had never held books, who had been told their minds were not meant for learning. Then he taught adults, men and women who had worked land they never owned, who had spoken softly their entire lives, unsure their voices had permission to rise. Elias taught them to speak, to sign their names, to stand. He became known simply as Teacher Elias in Savannah's growing freed community. He never married. He never left Georgia. He never again saw Lydia, but every lesson he taught carried her voice. Every time he wrote his own name, he remembered Jonas's hands guiding iron into form. Elias died in 1902 at the age of 53. His funeral was small, but there were no empty seats. People spoke of him the way one speaks of a lantern, quiet, steady, necessary. Clara found his grave at the edge of a churchyard, under a sprawling oak whose branches draped like sheltering arms. The headstone was simple. Elias. He opened what was closed. Not a single mention of the Marston family. No record of the chains he once lived under. Only the legacy of what he chose to unlock. Clara brought a photograph of the portrait with her. She placed it at the base of the stone and sat in the warm grass, listening to cicadas just as Elias once had. The key he held that day in 1856 did not save him from pain. It did not prevent loss. It did not grant escape. But it carried forward something greater. The belief that no lock lasts forever. And that was enough to change generations. The portrait from 1856 was never peaceful. It was a record of resistance captured in silence, waiting for the world to learn how to see it. Elias did not hold that key as a symbol. He held it as a promise, one passed from father to son, from memory to action, from fear to courage. History often remembers the powerful. But sometimes, the most important stories belong to those the world tried to erase. Not because they won in their own time, but because they refused to surrender their humanity. Elias never stopped opening doors.